Witty sky logic. When dinosaurs flew. 6 men and 1 bag. A scheduled Yak-42 flight. Kyiv to Ulyanovsk. We were heading out for retraining. There were supposed to be 6 of us in the group. One by one, we gathered at the airport and made our way toward the aircraft. The Yak-42 was still a fairly new airplane back then. Modern, even progressive for its time. 3 rear-mounted turbofan engines built in Zaporizhia, about 120 passengers, and one feature that always stood out: its built-in rear stairway. The tail section opened up, and there it was, your own private set of steps. Nikita Khrushchev, the same Soviet leader who once banged his shoe on the podium at the United Nations, absolutely hated that idea. When Soviet engineers proposed a government aircraft with a similar entrance, he rejected it immediately. I'm not going to board an aircraft through its backside. Well, ordinary people were less particular, and honestly, it was quite convenient. You climbed aboard, dropped your luggage onto the racks near the entrance, and then moved into the cabin. We did exactly that. 5 of us were already on board, standing near the door and waiting for the 6th. And we weren't just waiting. One of the guys had naturally produced a bottle of vodka and had already started pouring. Right then, Sasha came running up, slightly out of breath. "Guys, I've got a problem," he said. "I couldn't get one of the required documents. I'll fly in tomorrow." He dropped his bag next to the rest and added casually, "Just grab my bag, will you, so I don't have to carry it back and forth." "Sure, Sasha, no problem." All 5 of us agreed instantly, and that was a serious mistake, because Sasha hadn't asked one person. He had asked everybody, which, as experience repeatedly demonstrates, means nobody. On top of that, the group was already becoming a little cheerful. So when we arrived in Ulyanovsk, everyone collectively forgot about Sasha's bag and happily proceeded to settle into the dormitory. Sasha, as these things usually go, didn't arrive the next day. He arrived a week later. His first question was, "Where's my bag?" At that moment, we all experienced the same horrifying realization. Not one of us had remembered it. There had been no responsible person. The bag was eventually located at the airport's lost and found office. Problem solved. Or so we thought. A few days later, Sasha brought it back to the dormitory, opened it, and the room emptied instantly. People ran for the door holding their noses. "Good Lord! What is that?" It turned out that Sasha had packed some homemade food for the trip. Meat, fish, all the good stuff. By that point, however, it had evolved into something entirely different. The smell wasn't merely bad, it was catastrophic. It hit you like a physical force. Even after Sasha washed every item of clothing he owned, the damage had already been done. Whenever he entered the room, heads would turn, faces would tighten, and people would begin looking nervously toward the windows. Sasha naturally was furious. We naturally couldn't stop laughing. And just like that, the retraining began. Ulyanovsk, the birthplace of Lenin. Just a couple of years earlier, we had all lived in the same country. Now it was technically abroad, though it certainly didn't feel that way. There were no real borders yet, no passport control, no customs. And if someone had told us back then that Russia would one day bomb Ukrainian cities in an attempt to rebuild an empire, we would have considered that person completely insane. I had been to Ulyanovsk before, during my 2154 training. Back then, we spent most of our time in Kyiv and came here only for flight practice. This time, things were different. We were going to spend 2 full months in Ulyanovsk, studying the Il-62. After that, we'd return home. Simulator sessions and flight training would come later. The training center was still impressive. Not quite what it had once been, but impressive nonetheless. For decades, pilots from across the socialist bloc had trained here. Poles, East Germans, Hungarians, Bulgarians, practically everyone who flew Soviet aircraft. The theory itself wasn't particularly difficult for us. The Il-62 was older than the Tu-154 and far more conservative in design. No hydraulic boosters, just cables, rods, pulleys, and muscle power. Most of the instruments were familiar. The engines were familiar too. The airplane itself felt a little exotic, but we knew we'd eventually be carrying passengers in it, so we paid attention. Some details, however, were difficult to take seriously. The flap lever, for example. First you had to unlock it by rotating a protective ring, then push it down, then move it, then carefully watch the flaps, and at exactly the right moment, return it to neutral. The flight manual explained the procedure in a perfectly official tone, and then added one unforgettable sentence. The lever must be moved energetically to avoid malfunction. Energetically, not accurately, not carefully, energetically. Apparently, Soviet engineering occasionally appreciated enthusiasm. Outside, a harsh Russian winter had settled over the city, and we had 2 full months ahead of us, which meant it was time to get acquainted with Ulyanovsk. Like a mistake in the system, poverty, that was the natural condition of the early post-Soviet years. Life hadn't exactly been luxurious during the Soviet era either, but at least there had been food. There was a system, rigid, often absurd, but predictable. And Kiev, after all, was a capital. First of a Soviet republic, then of an independent state. That made a difference. The money was still the same, rubles. Though with each passing day, they seemed to dissolve in your hands. Not only because they were losing value, but because there was simply less and less to buy. Naturally, nobody talked much about entertainment. Survival itself was already a full-time occupation. One day, we were walking through Ulyanovsk, minus 10 degrees. A sharp wind that found its way through any coat, any collar, the kind of cold that doesn't attack. You simply realize, after a while, that it has already won. Soon we stepped into a gastronom. Today someone might call it a supermarket. That would be too generous. It was simply a large, state-run grocery store, the kind that still belonged to a system that no longer really existed. There were no private shops yet, no alternatives. Just this. It immediately reminded me of an old joke. I love to enjoy myself, especially when it comes to food. Only this time there was nothing to enjoy. The shelves were empty. In the meat section, there were bones covered with what had once been meat, now turning a tired shade of green. They were sold strictly by ration coupons. And there was a line, a real line, even though it was hard to imagine anyone eating that by choice. There was no alcohol at all. Gorbachev's anti-alcohol campaign had long disappeared together with Gorbachev himself. The shortages remained. Those were far more persistent. The whole place felt bleak. We stood there looking around, not even surprised, just confirming what we already knew. And then, suddenly, something didn't make sense. We turned and saw it. The fish section was empty too. Almost. The entire freezer counter was packed with enormous frozen ocean crabs. Huge claws, perfectly preserved, stacked one on top of another. It looked completely out of place, and there wasn't a single customer nearby. We looked at each other. What was the catch? Why was nobody buying them? The price? No. Cheap. Prices were still state-controlled and, at least in theory, affordable. Some kind of restriction? We walked over and asked. No restrictions? No. You mean we can buy as much as we want? As much as you like. There was a brief silence. Then we exchanged a glance. That was enough. A few minutes later, we were carrying 2 large cardboard boxes filled with giant frozen crab claws. For us, it was a delicacy. Something from another world. Why the local population had collectively ignored them remained a mystery. Perhaps they required too much effort. Perhaps they simply weren't part of the local cuisine. Or perhaps, when basic necessities become scarce, people stop noticing things that fall outside everyday survival. In any case, that was a philosophical question. We had a more practical problem. Eating something like that without beer was simply unacceptable, and there was no beer. We returned to the dormitory slightly triumphant, but not yet complete. One of our group, Yura, had a rather unusual talent. Back in his student days, he had worked part-time at a telephone exchange. As a result, he had developed a habit that was almost alien to Soviet life. He solved problems by telephone, not chatted, not complained, solved. There were no delivery services, no customer hotlines, no systems designed for convenience. But somehow, Yura treated the entire city as if it were a network he could access. And now, clearly, it was his moment. He picked up a telephone directory and began calling grocery stores throughout Ulyanovsk. One question. Do you have beer? No, 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 no again. Then finally, yes, a pause. I'd like to take a case. No problem. We'll be there shortly. He said it calmly, confidently. Back then, that tone alone could open doors. Telephones, after all, were not for everyone. They belonged to offices, managers, people who made decisions. We had 15 minutes before closing. We ran, to the tram, through the cold, carrying both the crabs and the idea of success. We arrived 2 minutes late. At the entrance, we were stopped. Where do you think you're going? We're closed. The tone was firm, not rude, just final. Politeness had never been considered an essential job skill, but Yura didn't react at all. We called about the beer, a pause, recognition. Oh, yes, yes, come in. And just like that, the system bent, only slightly, but enough. The salesperson even smiled. What had begun as a cold, empty evening turned into something else entirely. A feast, a small, perfectly constructed victory. Men will understand. A simple gathering, beer and magnificent crab, and all of it, in Ulyanovsk. That alone felt improbable. Put together, it was something you almost had to square. The retraining itself continued as expected. Lectures, notes, aircraft systems, everything gradually fell into place. Some of the guys even took crab back home to Kyiv. Not me. We had better food at home. But this was a real delicacy, before America. 2 months later, I received my certificate confirming completion of theoretical training on the Il-62M and immediately returned to flying the Tu-154. One morning, on my day off, I decided to go pick up my salary. Back then, bank cards were still a novelty, even in America. As for us, we didn't think about them at all. Cash was the only reality. At the crew bus stop, I ran into our squadron commander. 2154, our squadron. He had also recently retrained for the Il-62. Where are you heading? He asked. To pick up my salary. Oh, he nodded. We're 1 man short. We're flying to Moscow to Vnukovo for Il-62 simulator training. Then he added, You're coming with us. I hadn't planned anything like that. I hadn't even had breakfast. Just a cup of tea. But arguing with the squadron commander was never really an option. A couple of hours later, we were already in Moscow. There were several crews scheduled for simulator sessions, and by the time everyone finished, it was already around 4 in the afternoon. Then came the order. Move, straight to the aircraft, departure at 5. No breakfast, no lunch, not even enough time for a proper drink of water. We were moving fast. The others, however, had prepared. Not food, vodka. We stepped out onto the apron. There stood our Borispil-based 2134, 30 minutes before departure. Let's grab something quickly. There was a small staff cafe nearby. We rushed in, grabbed whatever food we could find, sat down and, because there was no time to waste, poured the vodka immediately into large glass tumblers, 250, maybe 300 grams. Nobody measured. We raised our glasses to successful completion of simulator training and drank. I was exhausted, hungry. The moment I relaxed and set my glass down on the table, the lights went out. Not figuratively, literally, like in a cinema, smooth and complete. With some effort, I pulled myself back. I focused on the salad in front of me and started eating as quickly as possible. At the same time, I glanced around, trying to determine how long I had been absent. Apparently not long. Nobody seemed to have noticed. Strangely enough, my mind remained perfectly clear. I understood one thing immediately. I had about 5 minutes. That was all. I needed to eat as much as possible and then find out whether I could still walk. The body, however, had already made its own decision. Perhaps out of pure surprise, it recovered remarkably fast. When we stood up, my walk was perfectly steady. On board, I drank several glasses of water. The simulator training was behind us. Next would come flight training without passengers. And after that, across the ocean. I arrived home still slightly tipsy, and without my salary. Many wives would have made a scene. Mine didn't even notice I had been drinking. I joked, "It's a little disappointing, you know. I'm drunk and you don't even notice." She just smiled. I've always been surprised by wives who greet a perfectly well-behaved husband with a lecture simply because he had a drink. The result is usually predictable. The husband eventually stops hurrying home. Near my apartment building in Kiev, where I still live today, there is a large underground parking garage, and right by the exit, a small bar. For people who have already parked their cars and are on their way home. I stop there occasionally myself. One day, I bought a small bottle and was heading out when the parking supervisor, a retired military officer, looked at me with obvious surprise. I smiled and said, "My wife doesn't mind. If I want to drink, I can drink at home." He studied me for a moment, then said quietly, "Take care of her." I've remembered those words ever since. Flight training came soon afterward. We spent hours over the Chernobyl exclusion zone, engine shutdowns and restarts in flight, emergency descents, everything according to the program. By the end of it, I was ready for what was officially called line training, real flights. It was no longer just an idea. America was beginning to look real. The uniform. At that time, we were still flying without uniforms. Everyone wore whatever they happened to have. There was no standard, no system, just a collection of pilots who happened to work for the same airline. Then a story began circulating. Somewhere in New York, one of our Il-62 crews had supposedly been stopped by immigration officers and refused access to the crew checkpoint. The explanation was simple. That doesn't look like a crew. And they were sent to stand in the regular passenger line. Whether it actually happened, I don't know. Maybe it did. Or maybe money had simply started appearing. And when money appears suddenly, people usually find ways to spend it quickly. The faster it's spent, the less control there tends to be. Those were the early days of private business. Small financial schemes were beginning to appear. In any case, something changed. Those of us who were flying, and especially those retrained for the Il-62, became some of the first people to receive the new Ukrainian airline uniform. Before that, Aeroflot uniforms had been mass-produced at state factories. You didn't choose. You were simply issued whatever happened to be available. Like many others, I did not fit the standard Soviet pilot template particularly well. The suit sat on me, let us say without elegance. Fortunately, gold shoulder boards attract attention. That helped. Now things were different. We received official referrals and were sent to private tailors. Mine worked in central Kiev. He was no longer young. You could tell immediately that he was a true professional, not because he talked about it, because of how he worked. Quiet, precise, attentive. He measured everything, not just sizes, proportions, posture, all the small details that make people different from one another. In the end, I received 2 uniforms, a winter version, wool, and a lighter summer version. Both black, both with sleeve insignia, international style, they fit perfectly. But the real masterpiece was the coat, a beautifully tailored black coat. Clean lines, perfect fit, and no insignia whatsoever. Buying something like that privately would have been difficult. At that time, and this may be hard to imagine now, we constantly visited one another's homes, with a reason, or without one. Today, people meet in cafes. Back then, cafes were only beginning to appear, and many looked more suspicious than inviting. So people visited friends instead. And I didn't just wear that coat myself. I rented it out. To friends. That coat had a surprisingly active social life. Meanwhile, the first Kyiv-New York flights were being operated non-stop. The Il-62M could comfortably cross the Atlantic, even with a full commercial payload. The flight took around 10.5 hours, sometimes longer. 2 crews were required. 1 crew alone would exceed duty limits, so we worked in shifts. Half the route 1 crew worked, the other rested. Though rested may not be the correct word. There were no dedicated crew rest compartments. We occupied empty passenger seats whenever possible. Sometimes it was easier to remain at your working position. The navigator certainly had no time for rest. He continuously worked with his navigation slide rule, updated calculations, monitored the route, and controlled the aircraft through the autopilot. The radio operator remained busy as well. As for the rest of us, we didn't complain. The average monthly salary back home, paid in a currency losing value almost daily, was roughly equivalent to $20. Prices in stores could change 3 times a day, but the per diem issued by the company representative in the United States belonged to a different universe. For a non-stop transatlantic flight, it was doubled, about $700. For us, that was an astronomical amount of money. Even in America, it wasn't insignificant. A New York subway ride cost around $1.50. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. At that point, I had officially transferred to the IL-62 squadron, not as a captain, not even as a regular crew member, as a trainee.